What if some of the most interesting wellness drinks today were not invented by modern supplement companies at all? What if their ingredients had already been part of everyday life thousands of years ago, appearing in biblical stories as symbols of nourishment, abundance, hospitality, survival, and restoration? Honey, pomegranates, grapes, milk, barley, vinegar, hyssop, figs, broth. Today, researchers are studying many of these same foods for compounds connected with cardiovascular health, digestion, blood sugar regulation, inflammation, and overall nutrition. That does not mean the Bible was written as a medical textbook, and it certainly does not mean an ancient drink can replace modern treatment. But it does raise an extraordinary question. How much practical wisdom was preserved in the foods people valued generation after generation? Today we are exploring 9 drinks and preparations connected to the biblical world. Some have surprisingly strong modern research behind them. Others have been surrounded by claims that go much further than the evidence. And one of the most important things we can do for our health is learn the difference. Let's begin with a combination almost everyone recognizes. Drink number 1, ginger and honey brew. Proverbs 24:13 tells us to eat honey because it is good. Throughout the Old Testament, honey repeatedly appears as a symbol of abundance, nourishment, and blessing. The Promised Land itself is famously described as a land flowing with milk and honey. Ginger is not prescribed alongside honey in Scripture, so we should not pretend this exact recipe is biblical. But pairing honey with aromatic roots and spices became part of traditional food and herbal practices across many cultures. And ginger gives us a particularly interesting example of why those traditions survived. Fresh ginger contains compounds called gingerols and shogalls. Researchers have studied them for their possible effects on inflammatory signaling, discomfort, digestion, and nausea. Ginger has perhaps earned its strongest reputation in the area of nausea. It has been investigated in pregnancy, post-operative recovery, motion-related nausea, and as an additional measure alongside standard treatment for chemotherapy-related nausea. The results are not identical across every study, which matters. Ginger is not a replacement for prescribed anti-nausea medication, but human trials suggest that it may provide useful support in certain situations. Some controlled studies have also found ginger helpful for menstrual discomfort, with reductions in pain reported in comparison with control treatments. Then we add honey. Honey is much more chemically complex than ordinary table sugar. It contains carbohydrates, organic acids, enzymes, plant-derived polyphenols, and small amounts of other biologically active compounds. One of the more practical areas of research involves coughs. Studies involving children with upper respiratory infections suggest that honey may help reduce nighttime coughing and improve sleep in some cases. There is one important exception. Honey should never be given to a child under 12 months because of the risk of infant botulism. Put ginger and honey together in warm water and you have something simple. Not a miracle cure, not a replacement for medicine. Just a traditional drink that combines the aromatic compounds of ginger with the soothing sweetness of honey. And sometimes the fact that something is simple is exactly why it lasts. Our next drink has an even clearer connection to Scripture. Drink number 2, pomegranate juice. In Song of Solomon, we find a direct reference to the juice of the pomegranate. That detail matters because the fruit was not only being eaten, it was being pressed and prepared as a drink. Pomegranates held a special place in the ancient Mediterranean world, appearing in food traditions and as symbols of abundance and fertility. Today they attract attention for a very different reason. Polyphenols. Pomegranates contain a remarkable group of plant compounds, including tannins such as punica lagens. Many of these compounds are especially concentrated in the peel and inner membranes, and some can enter the juice during processing. That has made pomegranate juice particularly interesting to cardiovascular researchers. One small long-term study involving people with severe carotid artery narrowing reported improvements in several cardiovascular markers among participants consuming pomegranate juice. Those findings attracted enormous attention. But science becomes stronger when results are repeated. And later randomized research did not find the same dramatic overall effect in every group studied. That tells us something important. Pomegranate juice may be interesting, but interesting is not the same as proven treatment. The fruit has also been studied in men with prostate cancer who experienced rising PSA after treatment. Early research reported changes in PSA doubling time, generating considerable excitement. But later controlled studies produced more mixed results. So pomegranate juice should never be sold as a cancer treatment or a way to clear blocked arteries. Its real strength is easier to defend. Pomegranates are nutrient-rich fruits containing a diverse mixture of polyphenols that scientists continue to investigate for cardiovascular and metabolic effects. And thousands of years before laboratories began measuring those compounds, people were already pressing this fruit into a cup. Now we move to perhaps the most famous biblical drink of all. Drink number 3, grape juice and wine. Genesis 40 gives us a striking image. Pharaoh's cupbearer dreams of a grapevine producing ripe clusters, then presses the grapes into Pharaoh's cup. From Genesis onward, vines and grapes appear again and again throughout Scripture. Grapes were eaten fresh. They were dried into raisins. They were pressed into juice. And of course, they were fermented. But from a modern wellness perspective, the most interesting story may be inside the grape itself. Dark-colored grapes contain anthocyanins, quercetin, resveratrol, and many other polyphenols. These compounds participate in complex biological processes involving oxidation, cell signaling, and vascular function. Small human studies involving purple and Concord grape juice have reported improvements in some measurements of blood vessel function. That does not mean grape juice prevents heart disease, but it gives researchers a reason to continue studying the interaction between grape polyphenols and cardiovascular health. Then we come to one of the most famous compounds in nutrition research, resveratrol. For years, resveratrol has been promoted as a so-called longevity molecule. In laboratory research, it interacts with pathways associated with cellular stress responses and proteins known as sirtuins. That sounds impressive, but there is an enormous distance between activating a pathway in a laboratory and extending the lifespan of a human being. At this point, we cannot say that drinking grape juice or taking resveratrol supplements makes people live longer. Quercetin has a similar story. Laboratory and animal studies suggest interesting neuroprotective properties. But that is not evidence that eating grapes prevents Alzheimer's disease. The more responsible conclusion is also the more useful one. Grapes are whole foods containing a complex mixture of phytochemicals that continue to be investigated for cardiovascular, metabolic, and neurological health. And if you want the compounds found in grapes without consuming alcohol, unsweetened grape juice is one option. Thousands of years after grapes were pressed into Pharaoh's cup, the fruit is still giving researchers questions to answer. Drink number 4, milk. Few biblical images are more recognizable than the land flowing with milk and honey. To modern ears, it can sound poetic. In the ancient world, it was practical. Regular access to milk meant you had animals. You had pasture. You had people capable of caring for those animals. And most importantly, you had a dependable source of food. Without refrigerators or supermarkets, that represented stability. Nutritionally, milk remains one of the most concentrated everyday foods available. It provides complete protein as well as calcium, phosphorus, potassium, vitamin B12, and in many fortified products in the United States, vitamin D. Its casein and whey proteins contain all 9 essential amino acids. That makes milk useful for maintaining muscle, bone, and other tissues when it fits comfortably into a person's diet. There is also an important misconception worth clearing up. Raw milk is sometimes promoted as dramatically more nutritious than pasteurized milk. But pasteurization does not meaningfully destroy the overall nutritional value of milk. What it does do is reduce the risk from dangerous microorganisms. For that reason, pasteurized milk is the safer choice. Milk also contains compounds researchers continue to study, including lactoferrin. Lactoferrin is an iron-binding protein particularly abundant in colostrum in human milk. It has interesting immune and antimicrobial properties in research settings. But ordinary cow's milk should not be treated as an antimicrobial medicine. Whey protein also provides cysteine, an amino acid the body can use when producing glutathione, one of its important antioxidant systems. Again, the important word is support. A glass of milk is food. It does not function like a therapeutic dose of a purified compound. And that brings us back to why the biblical image remains so powerful. Milk represented provision. Modern nutrition gives us another perspective on why a dependable supply of it could have been so valuable. Our next drink comes from a much humbler crop. Drink number 5, barley water. Barley was not the glamorous grain of the ancient world. That may be exactly why it mattered. It could grow under difficult conditions and became an important food for ordinary people. The book of Ruth unfolds during the barley harvest. Ruth gleans in the fields of Boaz, gathering the grain that helps keep her and Naomi fed. Later, Boaz sends her home with a generous amount of barley. In that story, barley is more than a crop. It represents survival. One traditional way of using barley was to simmer it in water and strain the liquid, creating what we now call barley water. The most studied nutritional component in barley is beta-glucan. Beta-glucan is a soluble fiber. When present in sufficient amounts, it can form a viscous mixture in the digestive tract that influences how cholesterol and carbohydrates are processed. The evidence is strongest for cholesterol. Research has found that diets containing sufficient barley beta-glucan can reduce LDL cholesterol and other cardiovascular risk markers. Beta-glucan-rich barley foods have also been studied for their ability to moderate the rise in blood glucose after meals. But there is an important difference between barley as a food and a cup of homemade barley water. The amount of beta-glucan that ends up in the liquid depends on the type of barley, how much is used, cooking time, the amount of water, and whether solids are removed. So one random cup cannot be assigned a guaranteed therapeutic dose. That is why barley water should not be marketed as a treatment for diabetes or high cholesterol. The stronger lesson is this: barley is naturally rich in a form of soluble fiber with well-established nutritional value. People in the biblical world relied on barley because it was practical, filling, dependable, and versatile. Modern nutrition gives us another reason to respect that humble grain. Drink number 6, vinegar and sour wine. Ruth 2:14 contains another fascinating food detail. Boaz invites Ruth to eat with his workers and tells her to dip her bread in vinegar. Acidic fermented foods were familiar throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Later cultures also consumed diluted sour wine drinks, including preparations commonly associated with Roman soldiers. But we should not confuse biblical vinegar with the modern bottle of apple cider vinegar sold in a grocery store. What connects them is acetic acid. Acetic acid is the main compound responsible for vinegar's characteristic acidity, and it has become the focus of several small human studies. Some trials suggest that consuming vinegar alongside certain carbohydrate-rich meals may reduce post-meal glucose responses or improve measures of insulin sensitivity. The effect does not appear to be identical for every person or every meal, and vinegar is not a diabetes treatment. But this research has helped scientists better understand how acidic foods may influence digestion and glucose handling. There is also a lot of exaggerated information surrounding vinegar. You may hear that it turns on a cellular switch that forces the body to burn fat, eliminates inflammation, or prevents cancer. Those conclusions go far beyond what human clinical research supports. Vinegar also has limitations. Because it is acidic, repeated concentrated exposure can damage tooth enamel and irritate the throat or esophagus. And people with certain digestive conditions, including gastroparesis, need particular caution because vinegar may slow stomach emptying. So once again, we find a familiar pattern, an ancient food practice, an interesting biological mechanism, some promising human research, and a much larger collection of claims that science has not yet proven. Drink number 7, hyssop tea. Psalm 51 contains David's famous plea to be cleansed with hyssop. Hyssop also appears elsewhere in biblical purification rituals, giving the plant an unusually powerful symbolic connection with cleansing. But there is a historical mystery here. The plant translated into English as hyssop may not actually have been the same plant we now call Hyssopus officinalis. Researchers have proposed that the biblical plant known as Ezov may have belonged to an oregano-like group native to the eastern Mediterranean. That means we should be very careful about claiming that modern hyssop tea is the exact plant described in Scripture. Still, Hyssopus officinalis has its own long history of traditional herbal use. It has been used in preparations associated with coughs, throat irritation, and respiratory discomfort. Scientists have identified a range of volatile and phenolic compounds in the plant, and laboratory research has reported antioxidant, antimicrobial, and anti-inflammatory activity. But laboratory results do not automatically become human treatments. Clinical evidence for hyssop remains limited. There has been some early research involving hyssop preparations and respiratory symptoms, but not enough to claim that drinking hyssop tea treats asthma, bronchitis, infection, or chronic inflammation. And there is one distinction that matters enormously. Hyssop tea is not the same thing as hyssop essential oil. Essential oils are far more concentrated, and certain hyssop oils contain compounds such as pinocamphone that have been associated with seizures when ingested in sufficient amounts. So concentrated essential oil should never be treated as though it were simply a stronger cup of tea. What remains fascinating is the symbolism. A plant associated with cleansing for thousands of years eventually became part of traditional herbal practice. But tradition, chemistry, and proven medical benefit are three different things. Knowing where one ends and another begins is part of using traditional wisdom responsibly. Drink number 8, fig water. Figs appear repeatedly in biblical imagery. They represented food, fertility, peace, and prosperity. The picture of someone sitting safely beneath a vine and fig tree became a powerful image of security. Figs were also practical foods. They could be dried, stored, transported, and carried over long distances. Across parts of the Mediterranean and Middle East, dried figs have traditionally been soaked or simmered in water to create simple preparations. And that leads to an obvious question. Does the water itself contain anything useful? Figs contain a range of naturally occurring polyphenols, including chlorogenic acid, rutin, and quercetin-related compounds. Some water-soluble components can move into liquid during soaking or cooking. But that does not mean a glass of fig water contains a predictable or therapeutic dose. This distinction becomes important because claims around fig water can quickly become exaggerated. Rutin and related compounds have been studied in defined preparations for symptoms associated with chronic venous insufficiency. But those studies are not the same as drinking water from soaked figs. Researchers have also investigated fig leaves and fig-derived compounds in connection with glucose metabolism. Again, that does not prove that dried fig water treats diabetes or controls blood sugar. The fruit itself gives us a much stronger nutritional argument. Figs provide fiber, minerals, natural carbohydrates, and a diverse mixture of phytochemicals. Dried figs can also be relatively concentrated in sugar and calories, which is worth remembering if portion size matters for you. So there is no need to transform fig water into another miracle drink. It can simply be a traditional preparation made from a nutritious fruit with an interesting history. And sometimes that is enough. Drink number 9, bone broth. In Judges 6, Gideon prepares food for the angel of the Lord. The meal includes a young goat, unleavened bread, and broth. The broth is mentioned separately. That detail reminds us that cooking liquid itself had value. For most of human history, people could not afford to waste nutritious parts of an animal. Bones, joints, cartilage, and connective tissue could be simmered for hours, extracting gelatin, flavor, and amino acids into the liquid. Today, we call a similar preparation bone broth. During prolonged cooking, collagen and connective tissue can break down into gelatin. The resulting broth may contain amino acids associated with collagen, including glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline. But there is one important limitation. Bone broth is not standardized. The nutritional profile changes depending on the bones, connective tissue, cooking time, temperature, acidity, water volume, and recipe. Studies measuring different broths have found substantial variation in their amino acid content. So a bowl of homemade broth cannot automatically be compared with a standardized collagen supplement. Another popular claim is that bone broth heals a leaky gut. At the moment, human evidence does not support treating bone broth as a proven therapy for intestinal permeability or inflammatory bowel disease. Researchers are interested in how certain amino acids and collagen-related compounds may interact with intestinal tissues. But that is very different from proving that broth repairs the gut. Glycine has another interesting story. Small human studies using isolated glycine before bedtime have reported effects on fatigue, sleep-related outcomes, and next-day performance under certain conditions. But those trials used measured amounts of purified glycine. They did not test a bowl of bone broth, and because glycine concentrations vary from broth to broth, the two should not be treated as equivalent. So why keep bone broth on this list? Because it does not need miracle claims to be valuable. It can provide fluid, flavor, protein-related amino acids, and a practical way to use ingredients that might otherwise be discarded. That is remarkably close to the reason people valued it thousands of years ago. And now we have reached the end of our 9 drinks. Ginger and honey, pomegranate juice, grapes, milk, barley water, vinegar, hyssop, fig water, bone broth. What connects them is not a hidden medical formula. It is something much more believable. People observed food carefully. They learned which crops stored well, which foods helped sustain people through difficult seasons, which ingredients were worth preserving, which drinks became part of hospitality, ritual, recovery, and daily life. Modern science gives us tools those cultures never had. We can isolate molecules, measure blood markers, run controlled trials, compare outcomes, and sometimes modern research supports parts of an old tradition. Sometimes it challenges them. Sometimes the answer is still uncertain. That is exactly why ancient wisdom and modern science do not need to be enemies. Tradition gives us questions worth asking. Science gives us a method for testing the answers. And perhaps the most useful lesson from these 9 drinks is not that ancient people somehow understood molecular biology. It is that they paid close attention to the foods around them. That kind of attention is still valuable today. Before we finish, one point is important. Nothing in this video is intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease. These foods and drinks should not replace medical care or prescribed medication. If you are managing diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, digestive disorders, or another chronic condition, speak with a qualified healthcare professional before making major dietary changes, especially if you take medication. Traditional foods can be part of a healthy lifestyle, but they belong alongside responsible medical care, not in place of it. Now I want to hear from you. Of these 9 biblical drinks and preparations, which one surprised you the most? Was it the research surrounding pomegranate, the beta-glucan in barley, the history of vinegar, or the surprising truth about bone broth and hyssop? Tell us in the comments, and if you already use one of these foods in your own routine, share how you prepare it. Someone reading your comment may discover an idea they have never considered before. If you enjoy exploring the connection between traditional foods, biblical history, and modern nutrition research, subscribe to Roots of Wellness. Here we look beyond health trends and dramatic promises. We examine what people have valued for generations, what modern science actually tells us, and where the evidence still has questions to answer. Because better health does not always begin with the newest supplement or the latest wellness trend. Sometimes it begins by looking again at simple foods that have been sitting in front of us for thousands of years. Thanks for watching Roots of Wellness, and until next time, nourish your body with knowledge, balance, and purpose.